Hello everyone, welcome to our first lecture in Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to get a sort of general overview of the topic, philosophy at large, but we're also going to dive into epistemology, which is a specific subfield in philosophy having to do with the theory of knowledge. Okay, so let's jump in. Introduction and Epistemology, Week 1. Alright, so what is philosophy? Well, from the Greek, it translates into something like the love of wisdom. But philosophy in general deals with some of the more fundamental questions that we have. For instance, whenever you consider whether or not life has any meaning, or whether or not we have free will, you might also ask questions like, can we ever truly know anything? Or what is right and wrong? Right? All of these kind of questions are inherently philosophical ones. But because these questions, as you might have noticed, are so broad, philosophy is divided into many smaller branches, each of which deals with its own little topics within the field. Here are the three largest areas that we're going to be dealing with. We have metaphysics, which is the study of the fundamental nature of the world. We have moral philosophy, which is the study of morality. And we have epistemology, the study of knowledge. That's going to be our topic this week. So starting off here, this is Aristotle. Let's talk about metaphysics really quickly. So the word metaphysics, you don't need to remember this, but it comes from a description of 14 of his books, specifically the ones that they thought should be read after his physics, right? Physics was another set of his works. The idea here was that only after you have mastered the study of this, the physical phenomena that Aristotle talks about, are you ready to dive into these things beyond them, right? So originally the term metaphysics just meant the works that you're supposed to read after Aristotle's physics. Nowadays, while the scope is, the topic is somewhat similar to what Aristotle was talking about, the scope is broadened quite extensively. So for Aristotle, metaphysics was just like an investigation into base reality, right? What is existence? What are the kinds of things that exist? And in what ways do they persist and causally interact? Metaphysics today is a lot more broad than that. The questions are kind of similar. We might ask, what is there? What does it mean to be? Or what does it mean to exist, right? How do we describe things that exist and how they interact with one another, right? Like, what is causation? How can one thing cause an effect elsewhere? These sorts of questions. Here's a few examples of more specific questions you might find modern-day metaphysicians asking. They might ask, is the fundamental nature of the universe solely physical? That is there anything but the physical? They might ask, what are mathematical objects, if they exist at all, right? So are numbers real in some sense like we are, or are they real in some more abstract sense? What does it mean to exist in an abstract sense, right? These are all metaphysical questions. Also, does a whole have properties over and above the sum of its parts? So, for example, you might ask, does an airplane have properties over and above the parts that make it up? A lot of people would like to say yes, right? The airplane as a whole can fly, whereas the property of flight you're not going to find in just the turbine engines of an airplane, right? So it seems like maybe a whole has something over and above its parts. These are all metaphysical questions. Okay. Moral philosophy. Moral philosophy has to do with how the world ought to be, right? How we ought to be and how the world around us ought to be. Metaphysics just tries to describe the way the world is, right? We're trying to understand the sort of fundamental nature of the world. Moral philosophy, how it should be, okay? Within moral philosophy, philosophers ask questions like, what is right and wrong? What is good and bad? Right? What makes someone blameworthy versus not blameworthy? We call that branch of moral philosophy normative ethics. Okay? But we also ask questions like, What should a person do in a specific case or about a certain issue? And that's called applied ethics. So, for example, in doing applied ethics, you might wonder whether or not a doctor has an imperative, like a moral duty, to deliver a treatment against a patient's will, for example. Some people, in fact, most medical professionals and most moral philosophers would say no in that case. In fact, it's obligatory that the physician not administer that treatment. But it is open for debate, and that is applied ethics, right? It's figuring out what we should do in specific cases. Then we have metaethics. Metaethics is the part of moral philosophy where we try to determine what it is that makes our moral judgments true or false, right? I can say murder is wrong, right? But what makes that true? What makes that true? That gets us into metaethics. So we would like it to be the case, or many moral philosophers would like it to be the case, that the judgments we make in applied ethics, right, like what should that physician do, what should they not do, based on what we discover in doing normative ethics, right? In doing normative ethics, we come to some sort of principle or set of principles, and from those, we can deduce what we ought to do in these specific cases. However, there are other moral philosophers who say you're not going to be able to come up with a set of rules or conventions that are going to apply to all of these different contexts, all of these different situations across the board, right? And if that's the case, normative ethics is not always, if ever, going to be a guide for applied ethics. These are really interesting topics. We're going to get to those when we discuss moral philosophy. But this week, we're going to be talking about epistemology, right? So generally, epistemologists are concerned with how we can know things, if we can know things at all, right? Maybe the skeptic's right and we can't know anything. What kinds of things we can know, and how we should conduct ourselves in trying to come to that knowledge, right? So what is knowledge? How do we get it if we can, right? What are the kinds of things we can know, and how should we behave as thinkers, right? If we want to be good thinkers, what are the kinds of things we ought to be doing? So next week, we're going to look more in depth into like the nature of knowledge, right? What is knowledge? How do we get it? Is the skeptic right and there's no knowledge available to us, right? These are questions we'll deal with next week. But for this week, we're going to talk about this notion called epistemic responsibility. Okay, so if you think there is something that makes a thinker like a good thinker, right? So you would say like, oh, well, good thinkers do these kind of things and bad thinkers do these kind of things. You likely already think there is this notion of epistemic responsibility. It just has to do with how we ought to behave as good thinkers, right? So to be epistemically responsible is to be a good thinker. To be epistemically irresponsible is to be thinking kind of carelessly, right? So we're going to be talking about epistemic responsibility here. You might already have some intuitions as to like what kinds of things make you a good thinker versus what kinds of things might make you a more careless or sloppy thinker. For example, if I gave you an example of someone who accepted this claim that aliens had just been spotted over the university simply because a stranger like told it to them in passing, you might think that that person was believing badly, right? That they were being epistemically irresponsible. They don't have enough evidence to believe that there are aliens above the university, right? Especially given that that claim is so incredible, right? If it was some small claim, like, oh, the library's closed today. Okay, if you believe that based on a stranger passing by's saying so, that's one thing. But believing that aliens have come specifically over the university, that's a bit stronger, right? You should probably have more, if you're going to accept that belief, than merely someone else is saying so. Similarly, though, if someone were to refuse to believe something that thousands of experts had come to independently over many years, we might question their standards regarding like what kinds of beliefs they're willing to accept, right? They might seem unreasonable, right? Well, there's these thousands of experts who clearly know much more than you do about this topic, saying that this is the case. These are all independent experts, and it's over many years. It seems like maybe you're being unreasonable if you don't give some credit to that, right? So it might also be epistemically irresponsible not to hold some beliefs given certain kinds of context and evidence, right? In both cases, there might be some epistemic irresponsibility here, but there's room for debate. Okay. So why study epistemology in general, right? Well, and why are we doing it first, right? First, why study epistemology in general? Second, why is it worth studying it at all? Okay. Knowing a bit of epistemology might allow you to understand the difference between knowledge and a mere belief, and thus allow you to sort between the two for yourself and others, right? There's a difference between knowing that something is the case and merely believing that something is the case. And these differences preferably would inform your actions, right? If you know that something is the case, well, then you have good reason for acting upon it, right? But if you merely believe that it's the case, maybe not so much. Maybe it should have less credence, right? So it is good practice, generally, I would say, to know the distinction between the two for yourself and others, right? Okay. Studying epistemology could allow you to compare competing beliefs more fairly. Right now, you might be wondering, how is it that a belief can be more justified than another? And you might have some intuitions, right? You might have some intuition like, well, some beliefs have more evidence than others. We have more evidence for some beliefs than we have others. But does that make them more justified? It's a topic of hot debate, let's say. We're going to get to the notion of justification next week, but let's just say it's more complicated than that, right? And with a proper understanding of what this justification thing is, you might be able to adjudicate between these beliefs and whether or not you should hold them more fairly, right? Further, it could help you decide whether you have sufficient reason for acting or if you are believing impulsively, right? This kind of bleeds out of the first example we have here. Further, there's some philosophers like William K. Clifford, who we're about to turn to, who argues that we have a moral duty to be careful thinkers, right? So not only should you just study epistemology because it's fun or useful, people like Clifford suggest you have a moral duty to be a careful thinker, which might mean you have a moral duty to know what it means to be a careful thinker, right? Okay. We're going to get to Clifford on the next slide here. As to why epistemology is a subject we're studying first, there's two primary reasons. First, I am an epistemologist, right? That's what I study. So naturally, I think it's like the most fun thing to talk about, right? We're going to kind of lead the course on this. The rest of the stuff is good too. You'll enjoy the rest of the material. In fact, you might enjoy it more than epistemology. But for me, what really gets me excited is talking about epistemology. But the greater reason is that all of the stuff we're going to end up discussing in this class, in some way, are ultimately going to rest on some assumptions about the stuff we're talking about here and now, right? So, for example, if you don't have a way of defeating the skeptic who claims that you can't know anything, right? Then the claims you make about, let's say, free will or the meaning of life, right? They're going to be subject to those same criticisms, right? They don't have a foundation from which they can stand. So if you don't have answers to these epistemic questions first, it might seem like answers to these other questions are kind of free-floating, right? They're dependent on this kind of IOU you've given to the epistemologist. Like, oh, I'll get to that later. Now, It is certainly still possible to do other philosophical investigations without doing epistemology first, without leaving it all, settled and firm. That is what most philosophers do. But we should still be aware that there are these issues that are lurking in the background, right? That there are these unsettled issues. That if, things go wrong, for example, and the skeptic ends up being right, all of the work we've done is more or less fruitless, right? If the skeptic ends up being right that we can't know anything, well, then all the stuff we've done, all the talk that we've had about free will, the nature of goodness, meaning of life, these kind of things, ultimately amount to nothing because we can't know that they're the case, right? So we should at least be aware that those kinds of things are out there. Okay, so this is W.K. Clifford, and this is a quote from him. In fact, this quote comes from the piece that I'm assigning you to read. He says, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." Okay, so he more or less gives you his stance here on epistemic responsibility right out the gate, right? This more or less is defining of his stance on epistemic responsibility. And before we move on to his arguments, I want to draw your attention to the way or the strength with which he is delivering his conclusion here, right? In philosophy, we talk about these things called universals, right? A universal in this context means that it applies to an entire class of things, not just particular little cases, but all cases, right? So he says, for example, it is wrong always. So always is a universal, right? It means that it's applying to all periods of time, all time. Everywhere is another universal, right? Every place, right? Every point in space, this applies to. And for anyone, another universal, right? Believe anything. Anything is another universal. Okay, so the reason I bring this up is that in philosophy, when you introduce a universal into your claim, it becomes extremely strong. And by strong here, I don't mean argumentatively strong in the sense that it's hard to rebuff, right? It's hard to argue against. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Strength in this sense just means how much it applies to, right? How much your argument is supposed to capture. The more that your argument is supposed to capture, the easier it is to object to your argument. Why? Well, because if it's supposed to apply to all of these things universally, if you find even one case where this doesn't fit, even one case, we call this a counterexample. If you can find even one example that doesn't fit this, the argument fails, right? Even one case that doesn't fit this schema causes the entire argument to fail. So Clifford here, he has 1, 2, 3, 4 universals, right? So he is being quite bold in establishing his argument with so many universals, right? This is incredibly strong. He's not giving room for anyone to try and escape his principle. But this is going to have the consequence that it's going to be somewhat easy, perhaps, to find little ways to object. Okay. So Clifford starts with a parable, right? He gives us what's called the parable of the ship owner. In the parable of the ship owner, Clifford describes the ship owner who has begun to doubt whether or not his ship is actually seaworthy anymore, right? He starts to think, it hasn't had the maintenance it's supposed to have. I saw maybe some signs that it's no longer seaworthy, so I'm becoming concerned that this ship might sink if I send it out, right? But these thoughts made the ship owner very unhappy. These doubts made the ship owner extremely unhappy. He's going to lose a lot of money. If he has to retrofit this ship, he has to have repairs done, he's going to have... These are a lot of out-of-pocket expenses, not making him very happy, right? So somehow or other, he manages to convince himself, like genuinely convince himself, that his ship was safe. I mean, the ship has sailed across the sea many times before, nothing bad has happened. It's probably okay. So he convinces himself the ship is safe, he allows the passengers to board, and while they're on their journey, the ship sinks and all of the passengers lose their lives, right? Um, the ship owner here is clearly at fault, right? They're at fault for, because of their negligence, they're at fault for the loss of life. But Clifford wants to say something more. He wants to say they're at fault for believing badly, right? One of the sins the ship owner has committed here is that they believed without sufficient evidence, right? They convinced themselves, they allowed themselves to believe that this ship was actually safe when it wasn't. Okay, so let's break it down. Unpacking the parable here. So he's trying to accomplish multiple things. First, it's clear that the ship owner was wrong, like as a matter of fact, right? The ship was not safe. So his belief ended up being false. Because his belief was false, we then have good reason for questioning the process that led him there, right? So at the end of the day, his belief about the seaworthiness of the ship was wrong, and therefore the reasons he used to get there are suspect. Yeah, if a sort of belief-forming process is leading you towards false beliefs, it's probably not a great belief-forming process. That's the idea. Now, it should be noted, however, that even really good belief-forming processes are going to lead you to believe some false things, right? There's no like belief forming process that I can think of that is going to get it right every single time with certainty. Okay, so just because a belief forming process leads you to believe something that was false once, it doesn't mean it's bad, right? It doesn't mean it's bad. The way philosophers typically measure these things is by the frequency, right? So like how often would this belief forming process lead you to false beliefs? If it's quite often, then it's a bad belief forming process, right? But if on average it leads you to more true claims, well, okay, maybe it's not so bad. In this case, though, the ship owner was really just practicing what we might call wishful thinking, right? Like they really wanted the ship to be safe. And because they really wanted that, they allow themselves to believe it. That belief forming process is probably going to go wrong all the time, right? Just because I want something to be the case doesn't mean that it is going to be the case. So this is probably not a good belief forming process. Second, Clifford here is using the parable to show that being epistemically irresponsible, so believing without good reason, can lead to tangible harm, right? These aren't just things going on in the mind and that's where they stay. Clifford is trying to point out to us here, look, if you believe badly, this could have real world consequences. You could end up hurting people, right? Yourself or others, right? Clifford says the ship owner believed even though he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. And because of that, people died, right? So epistemic irresponsibility, not just a problem for whether or not you're being a good thinker, right? Might have real world consequences. Okay. From this, Clifford draws a moral conclusion, right? Remember that slide where I showed you his quote? He says, it is wrong, right? And he doesn't just mean it's epistemically wrong. He means it is morally wrong to believe on insufficient evidence. Why? Well, because he has found this link between epistemic irresponsibility and real harm, right? You think badly, this could lead to real harm. Because of that, Clifford says there's this moral link, right? It is morally wrong, then, to believe on insufficient evidence. Okay, so interesting consequences of this. Firstly, if the ship owner had been right, okay, if the ship owner was right in that the ship didn't sink this time, right? It was fine. It didn't sink, as in Clifford's example. Clifford would say he's still morally wrong, right? He still did something morally wrong. Why? Why is that the case? Well, because he still didn't have the evidence for that belief. He just got lucky, right? He was lucky that his ship didn't sink and all of those people didn't die. That's not being responsible, right? Being lucky isn't being responsible. He had no reason to believe that his ship was safe. Okay, so as Clifford states here, the question of right or wrong has to do with the origin of his belief, not the matter of it. Not what it was, but how he got it. Not whether it turned out to be true or false, but whether he had a right to believe on such evidence as was before him. So it doesn't matter if things turned out fine at the end of the day. The actual crime here, the actual moral sin, was the believing, was the allowing himself to believe as he did without sufficient evidence. Interesting. That's an incredibly strong claim, right? Now, to be clear here, Clifford is not just saying that the ship owner would have still been morally blameworthy if the ship arrived safely despite being in poor condition, right? So in this case, the ship is actually not seaworthy. It's just that the ship owner got lucky this one time, right? Sure, he's still wrong there. But Clifford is making a stronger claim. He is saying, even if the ship was seaworthy, right? Even if there was no possible harm to the passengers because the ship genuinely is safe, the ship owner would still be morally wrong in having this belief. Why? Because they didn't have the evidence to support that belief. And this is a pretty strong claim. Okay. But why is simply holding a belief without sufficient evidence morally wrong? We can understand why holding a belief without evidence that then leads to actual harms, like tangible harms, is morally wrong. That seems to be pretty clear-cut, right? But why is the mere holding a belief without sufficient evidence morally wrong for Clifford? Clifford gives a few reasons. First, he argues that beliefs that we hold inevitably influence our judgment, including our judgment about further evidence for our beliefs, right? So basically what this amounts to is that if you hold on to some bad beliefs, like some beliefs that you don't really have good reason for holding, those beliefs could, and Clifford thinks will ultimately, influence the way in which you engage with other possible beliefs. Now that you've accepted one, it's kind of like opening the floodgates, right? You're going to end up welcoming in even more bad beliefs, okay? So here Clifford is concerned that if you allow yourself to believe badly, you are more likely to adopt more bad beliefs in the future, right? This is because you will end up using some of those badly formed beliefs to judge whether you should accept a new belief or get rid of your current ones. Okay, if you're familiar at all with a psychological phenomenon called confirmation bias, this should ring a bell for you, right? Confirmation bias occurs when you have a belief currently or some kind of conviction, and it affects the way that you evaluate further information, right? So on average, we tend to prefer source material that supports our current beliefs over others. Right, so we tend to seek out and approve of material that agrees with us, regardless of the quality of their arguments, over contrary material. Right, so this is exactly what Clifford is afraid of. Okay, second, Clifford argues that when our beliefs are genuinely held, they do typically influence our action. So it's not going to be the case that you might just have these harmless beliefs that you've formed without good reason, right? Clifford thinks it's very likely that those beliefs, if you genuinely do hold them, are going to end up influencing what you do. And when it starts to influence what you do, we could start to get those tangible harms out in the world. But finally, perhaps most importantly, he thinks that holding beliefs without good reason is not just a personal problem for you, but it extends to society at large. Let's get into that. In fact, he calls it like a plague, right? Bad believing is like a plague. Okay. So obviously, as we saw with the parable of the ship owner, we know that if you hold on to a bad belief and you do certain things because of that bad belief, you could end up hurting people, right? Like sending the ship out when it's not safe was clearly harming these other people, in part due to this bad belief that the ship owner was holding. But Clifford thinks that there's more. Clifford thinks that there's a broader problem here. Specifically, he thinks that if you choose to believe badly, that could influence, in fact, encourage bad believing in other people as well. You might, for example, share some of those badly formed beliefs, those beliefs that you don't really have good reason for holding, with people who rely on you as a source of information, right? So, for example, parents, they might spread their bad believing to their children, not just in the sense that they are likely to spread these particular bad beliefs, about like, I don't know, the earth is flat or something like that, right? To their children or someone else. But they're likely to spread the process of bad believing to these people who rely on them as well, right? So it's even worse than just spreading some simple single bad belief. Okay, so for example, a person who has adopted some bigoted beliefs about other classes of people, right? They might spread those to the people around them. We really only need to look through human history to see how many tangible harms can come about and how quickly these kind of bad beliefs can spread, right? So here, this is probably the strongest point Clifford has to make, right? Your bad believing is not a personal problem. Yes, there are things that you shouldn't do for your own sake, right? Like you should want to be a good thinker, and therefore you should want to avoid violating this principle, Clifford wants to say. But what's more important is that your bad believing is going to affect other people in a myriad of ways, right? It's going to potentially have tangible consequences for them, like the parable of the ship owner. You are going to encourage people not only to hold the bad beliefs you found, but in addition to adopt the process of bad believing that you have on board, right? So you are in effect going to amplify the consequences of this far, far downstream. Okay, so Clifford then means to suggest that people who believe without sufficient evidence are a direct moral threat to the world. That is why believing without sufficient evidence for Clifford is a moral harm, right? It is a moral problem. Okay, so Clifford talks a lot about sufficient evidence. What is that? How much evidence is sufficient? What counts as evidence, right? These are fair questions to ask when Clifford is making such a strong claim, right? Clifford is willing to morally condemn us if we don't satisfy his standard. So it would be nice if we knew exactly what he wanted out of us, right? Okay. Unfortunately, Clifford doesn't really give a straightforward answer. He doesn't tell us, one, what evidence is, and two, how much of it we need in order to actually satisfy his standard. But based on a few things he does say, we can draw a few inferences. Okay, first quote. No man holding a strong belief on one side of a question, or even wishing to hold a belief on one side, can investigate it with such fairness and completeness as if he were really in doubt and unbiased, so that the existence of a belief not founded on fair inquiry unfits a man for the performance of his necessary duty. Okay, so from this, we can infer that Clifford thinks you cannot be a fair judge of a belief's acceptability if you already hold it, right? If you already hold the belief, he thinks you're not going to be a fair judge. So in collecting this evidence, we need to be ultimately impartial. So impartial that we don't even want the belief to be true necessarily, right? he says even wishing to hold a belief on one side, right? So we need to be in a position where we could go one way or the other in order to evaluate this belief, right? On the other hand, it might be for Clifford that we can allow other people to do that for us, right? If we are in a situation where we are invested, right? I do want this to be true versus that, but I still want to be an epistemically responsible thinker. I might still be able to offload that duty onto someone else who isn't as invested, right? Maybe. Okay, second quote. Belief is desecrated when given to unproved and unquestioned statements, for the solace and private pleasure of the believer, to add a tinsel splendor to the plain straight road of our life and display a bright mirage beyond it, or even to drown the common sorrows of our kind by a self-deception which allows them not only to cast down, but also to degrade us. Okay, very poetic. But the things that we can draw out of this passage particularly has to do with the unproved and unquestioned bit, right? Unquestioned, we already got, right? We already know Clifford's going to say, if you hold on to a belief in an unquestioned way, that's bad. He clearly thinks you need to be able to subject it to doubt, unbiased doubt. Okay, so unquestioned, we already knew that. But unproved, whoa, that's much stronger, right? Here it seems that Clifford is suggesting we might need to be able to prove the things we believe, right? So for sufficient evidence for Clifford, what that means, what sufficiency means, might be proof, right? If that's the case for Clifford, you're not allowed to believe anything that can't be proven, that you don't have proof for. Maybe you didn't come up with the proof, right? Maybe someone else did, but it seems like you still need access to that, right? That's a pretty strong demand, right? How many of your beliefs do you think you can prove? Or how many beliefs do you think you have good reason for thinking there are proofs of, right? When you really think about it, probably not many, right? Probably not many. Okay. So we don't exactly know what sufficient evidence for Clifford is, but we know that it seems to be pointing towards some kind of unbiased line of questioning or doubt as an investigation of those potential beliefs, and that perhaps ultimately those beliefs ought to be proven in such an unbiased fashion. Okay. This makes Clifford what we now call, in contemporary parlance, an evidentialist, right? An evidentialist is someone who thinks that we should only hold beliefs that we have adequate evidence for. Now, again, for the evidentialist, much like Clifford, it's not immediately clear what adequate is, right? How much evidence do we actually need in order to be thinking well under these terms, right? Some evidentialists say one thing, some evidentialists say another. But even for them, Clifford is pretty high up there, right? His standard seems to be extremely strong, especially if he's going to require proof, right? If he's going to require proof, that's extremely strong. So is Clifford then too demanding, right? Is his standard too strong? There's two concerns here. First, if Clifford is right, it might be the case that we can hardly ever, if ever, have the grounds to hold beliefs, right? If his standard really requires us to be able to prove the things we believe, well, that means what we can believe without having, committing some kind of moral harm, is going to be restricted to a very narrow band of things, right? There just aren't proofs for that many things, right? That could be a problem if we would like to know things, right? If we would like to go around having beliefs and thinking that we know things, this might be a problem for us. Second, there is this worry that Clifford's epistemic standard might be too strong. But okay, whatever. Clifford's epistemic standard is too strong. It's not really hurting anyone. What might be hurting people, what might be unjust, is his moral condemnation of epistemic irresponsibility, right? It's one thing to say that you are epistemically irresponsible if you believe in certain ways, right? So if you believe without sufficient evidence, you're being epistemically responsible. That's one claim, right? We can separate that claim from the claim that, and if you're being epistemically responsible, you're doing something immoral, right? Two entirely different claims that Clifford is smushing together, right? Okay, Clifford has a response already for the concerns of the first kind, right? That his standard's just way too strong. It's going to mean that we don't have many beliefs that we can hold on to. Here's what he says. But, says one, I am a busy man. I have no time for the long course of study which would be necessary to make me in any degree a competent judge of certain questions, or even able to understand the nature of arguments. Then he should have no time to believe. Right? Okay. So Clifford is doubling down. He's saying, yeah, if you think that's going to be too demanding, if you think that my standard's just too demanding, you're not going to be able to have many beliefs, too bad, right? Too bad. You don't have a right to those beliefs. You're trying to believe without sufficient evidence, and that's wrong. So that, sorry, but you don't have the right to them, right? So he just doubles down. He doesn't, however, have a response for the second concern. We're going to turn to that second concern at the end of the lecture today. But for now, we're going to turn to the first, right? William James, another philosopher, sort of contemporary, maybe 20 years or so after Clifford, responds to him, right? Along this lines that Clifford, your standards are simply far too strong. Okay, so let's hear from James now. Here's a quote. Our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say under such circumstances, do not decide, but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or not, and is attended with the same risk of losing truth. Okay, so the James piece that I've assigned can more or less be captured in this this one paragraph here, but it's a bit tricky to read, right? If you're not familiar with this kind of philosophical writing, particularly this kind of older philosophical writing, right? The key things to take away from this passage, James here is saying, look, if you're like Clifford and you want to say that in cases where you don't have sufficient evidence, you ought to abstain from believing, right? I'm gonna sit back and say, well, I don't have good reason, and therefore I'm not going to decide the matter, right? I'm not going to believe one way or the other. That in itself, James wants to say, is an epistemic choice you have made. You've decided to do that, so you aren't guilt-free, right? You're not out of this situation. You are making a decision yourself, just like if you had decided to believe or refuse to believe. And it has consequences. Namely, the consequence that James is concerned about is that you might lose out on some truths, right? So sure, Clifford, sure, maybe you're right. Believing without sufficient evidence could lead to some harms. But refusing to have a belief just because you don't have a proof for it could mean that you lose out on some valuable truths, right? That's going to be the gist of James's argument here. But let's get into the specifics. All right, so the paper that we're reading from James, it's an essay. It's called The Will to Believe. This is first given as a lecture in 1896. Here, James is mostly concerned with defending things like religious faith and other similarly held strong beliefs from philosophers explicitly like Clifford. He names Clifford several times. Okay, so how does he do this? How does he get there? Main things. The first is that James's charge is that human nature doesn't allow us to act in the way that philosophers like Clifford seem to think it does, right? So in order for Clifford's view to work, it seems like it has to be possible that our mental faculties can override like our impulses, right? James wants to say something like, the way in which we come to the beliefs that we hold is not up to us. It's not in our control, at least not totally, right? And think about that, right? Something happens or someone says something to you. You form a belief. You just do, right? It seems to be an impulse. It's not this process by which you take this idea and you consider it in a neutral way, weighing the evidence one way, weighing the evidence the other way, until you ultimately decide in a very rational way, I'm going to go this way about this idea. That tends not to be the way it happens, right? It tends to be the case that you have an aha moment, or you are just pulled one way or the other. So the first point James wants to make is, Clifford, that's just not the way things work, right? You can have your view, but that's not the way belief formation works, and so it's not going to be an option, right? The kind of thing you're demanding simply isn't possible. Okay. Second, James argues that there are cases where it is entirely reasonable for us to believe without conclusive evidence. So not only is it the case that we just are going to believe this way, despite whatever Clifford, thinks or wants from us, this is the way we believe, and we're going to keep doing it. That's just the way humans work. But second, and that's not so bad, right? That's James's his second point to take away here. We're going to do it, and it's not so bad, at least in some cases. Okay, so more on that now. Believing without certainty or without the kind of proof that Clifford seems to require. He's got a few moves here. First, he thinks that accepting some beliefs without conclusive evidence, without that proof that Clifford seems to want, is necessary for the pursuit of truth itself. So what he means by this generally is that we are sometimes going to need to accept a belief without proof, without evidence, in order to see if it works, right? In order to test it out, in order to take it out into the world, give it a spin, so to speak, and see whether or not it works, right? When you think about the scientific process, right, this might ring a bell, right? Think about hypotheses, right? If a scientist doesn't form a hypothesis first, what exactly are they testing? What exactly are they looking to produce in terms of their conclusions, right? It's not at all clear. James here is saying, in those specific kinds of scenarios, it is okay to believe without sufficient evidence. It's okay to believe with very little evidence, in fact, so long as you are testing that belief, right? You are trying it out in the world, and importantly, willing to revise it when you encounter problems, okay? James is a pragmatist. What I just said more or less defines pragmatism, right? Pragmatists in philosophy think that it's okay to hold on to beliefs without certainty, right? So long as you take those beliefs out into the world, you give them a good, honest try, see whether or not they work, and if they don't, you change them. You either change them or you get rid of them, right? So they are constantly developing what they believe. They don't have a belief that remains sacred, right? That is forever like cemented into the halls of truth, right? When you think of Clifford wants proof before he believes. Because of that, his beliefs aren't really ever going to be changing, right? As soon as you get that belief that's good for Clifford, it's stuck. It's there. For the pragmatist, quite the opposite, right? They hold on to a belief only so long as it's useful or doing well, okay? All right, here's a quote. I live by the practical faith that we must go on experiencing and thinking over our experience, for that's the only way our opinions can grow more true. But I believe it to be a tremendous mistake to hold any opinion, I absolutely do not care which, as if it could never be reinterpreted or corrected, and the whole of philosophy, I think, will support me in this. That last claim, not the case, right? He's disagreeing with Clifford. Clifford's a philosopher, and it's not the case. But what James is trying to point out here is that, look, this kind of belief that you're after, Clifford, there are these other ones that so long as they're open to being revised, they're open to being reinterpreted or corrected, there's no harm, There's no harm in believing these things. Okay. Second, James is arguing that philosophers like Clifford, who are focused on avoiding error, are going to end up losing too much of value. Okay? In sticking to their principles, he says, in order to not be duped, right? To be duped by falsity, right? They don't want to be wrong. People like Clifford, James thinks, are really desperate to avoid being wrong. In doing so, they lose out on potential truths, right? Because they're not willing to take that risk, to take that chance in believing something that might be wrong. They end up losing a certain amount of truth as well. Some of those truths, James thinks, are not worth losing in order to protect ourselves from falsity. Okay, free will is one case where James thinks this is the case, right? Do we have sufficient evidence for believing in free will? James, it's complicated, but at some points in his career, James thinks no, we do not have good reason for thinking there's free will. But in believing in free will, so many good things come about that ultimately that becomes his argument for free will, right? We're going to see that later in the course when we get to the topic of free will. And finally, James argues that there are some instances in which the world just doesn't give us the appropriate amount of time to do all that Clifford demands, right? We need to make a decision now, right? We need to come to a belief now. We don't have time to sit here and give an unbiased reflection in order to prove this belief one way or the other, right? Some instances demand that we come to belief one way or the other. Okay, so for example, suppose that you're crossing a street and you hear the sirens of an approaching ambulance. You don't know whether or not the ambulance is coming in your direction. You look both ways, but you don't see it. Okay? But you do hear the sirens, and perhaps it sounds like they're getting closer. Because you haven't seen it, you don't have conclusive evidence that the ambulance is approaching you, right? And thus, you don't have conclusive evidence that it's unsafe for you to cross the street. But you could decide to believe that despite that lack of evidence, right? You could decide to believe it's maybe unsafe for me to cross the street, right? Despite the fact that you don't have enough evidence for that claim. James here wants to say, look, any rational person is going to say that was perfectly fine, right? That was a reasonable belief to hold, even though you didn't have a proof, even though you didn't have sufficient evidence. You're excused, right? But it seems like Clifford can't give you that. It seems like Clifford, because his demands are so strong, is going to say, no, you didn't have a right to that belief, right? Okay. How does James get us here, right? It's one thing to say you're excused, right? But why? Well, James is saying there's three conditions that if you meet, you can be excused for believing in something without evidence, right? Not just sufficient evidence, but without evidence, right? The first condition is the idea has to be a live one. What James means here is that you have to be in a position such that you think it's actually possible, right? So for me, if you were to say, like, when you add 2 and 3, you get 400, right? That's so absurd to me that it's not a live option, okay? But if you were to tell me, well, one day humans are going to set foot on Mars. Okay, I don't know if that's true. I don't really have great evidence to say one way or the other, but it's a live option to me. I think it's possible. So sure. So there's a difference between a live option and a not live one. So the first condition, the belief needs to be live, right? It needs to be possible for you to accept, okay? Second, the occasion for believing must be a forced one. What this means is that you have to decide, right? There is not this middle ground that you can take. So in the case of the astronaut walking on Mars, I could say, I don't know, right? I'm not going to believe one way or the other. There's really no stake in it for me. So it's not a forced belief, right? Not a forced one. Some other kinds of beliefs, though, might be, right? Like, James's example is something like, accept that this is true or not, right? Well, you only have two choices, right? Do you or do you not? Okay, so it has to be forced. Finally, the idea must be a momentous one. What that means is that it's actually valuable to you, right? Whether or not this thing is true matters to you. Okay, so once again, using the astronaut walking on Mars, it doesn't matter to me that much. So that belief, the occasion for believing, is not a momentous occasion. But we could imagine someone like an astronaut in training, right, who like desperately wants to set foot on Mars, right? That is like her dream or something like that. Now the occasion for believing is momentous, right? So these kind of things fluctuate depending on your context. They depend on who you are, right? Whether or not an idea is a live one kind of depends on you. Whether or not the idea is a momentous one depends on you, right? What's momentous for you might not be momentous for me. Okay, so here, again, James is saying, look, not only can you believe without sufficient evidence, but you can believe without evidence at all, so long as that belief is a live one, a forced one, and a momentous one. You get all three of those things, and you don't really need evidence at all. Now, he's using this in order to say, like, belief in God, for example, even like a specific God, is reasonable without evidence, right? So this is kind of like something of a defense of faith as well. We won't get too much into that, though we do have a unit on philosophy of religion coming not too far in the future. Okay, James versus Clifford then. How do these two meet up? So clearly James thinks that Clifford's standard is too strong. First, he thinks that humans don't behave this way, right? We're going to have these beliefs that don't have sufficient evidence regardless of what you want. Even Clifford, James says, you're going to be doing this, right? You can't help it. That's just the way humans are. Second, in being so afraid of getting things wrong, you're going to end up losing all of these valuable truths. And third, perhaps there are these ways in which we can hold on to beliefs that don't have evidence at all, right? So long as certain conditions apply. Clifford, on the other hand, he's not going to have any of it, right? He died before he was able to respond to James. It would have been very interesting. But it's pretty clear, I think we can tell from what Clifford has said thus far, that he's not going to be backing down, right? Okay, so the question remains, is it wrong all the time, everywhere, for everyone to believe anything without sufficient evidence? Okay. James has hoped to poke a few holes in at least a couple of these universals. Is it wrong all the time? Well, no. Some occasions the world forces you to choose right now, like the case of the ambulance, right? Is it true for everyone? Well, some of these beliefs are going to be momentous for people in such a way that perhaps it's okay for them to believe without any evidence at all. Believe anything? Well, there are some cases where we need to adopt a belief like a hypothesis in order to test it out first, right? So James is trying to poke holes in like each one of these universals, more or less. Okay. For his part, again, Clifford would likely not bow here to James, right? Yes, Clifford might say, we could lose out on some potentially valuable truths, but importantly, what James does not do in this essay is address Clifford's concerns about how bad believing causes real, tangible harm in the world. Okay, sure, James, maybe you're right that I'm going to end up losing some of these truths because I'm so afraid of getting things wrong. But I'm not just afraid of getting things wrong because I don't want to be wrong, right? I'm afraid of getting things wrong because being wrong in this way can hurt people, right? It can make the world worse, right? In a drastic way. And James really doesn't say anything about that, right? James is purely, it seems, concerned with the epistemic. He doesn't address the ethical component of Clifford's work, right? Okay. Now, remember, I told you that Clifford could be divided into those two things that he kind of smashes together. There's that concern that his standard might be too strong, right? His standard of epistemic responsibility. What it means to be epistemically responsible is to only believe when you have sufficient evidence. Then there's his other claim. If you are being epistemically responsible, you're doing something morally wrong, right? He brings these two together, but our criticisms of them can be separate. Right, so James has attacked the first, right, his epistemic standard. I think there is a way that we could put pressure on his moral standard as well, right? Okay, so is believing badly actually a moral offense? Well, I have an example for us here. Putting Clifford to the test, right? We can imagine the following scenario. An accident aboard a space station has jettisoned an astronaut into space. Because she was alone on the space station, there is no chance of rescue, and she does not have the means to return to safety herself. In such a case, it is highly unlikely that our astronaut has sufficient evidence for believing that she will be rescued. However, it may provide some small comfort to her to believe otherwise. If she decides to believe that she will be rescued, has she done something immoral? So, the tricky bit about this case is that under Clifford's standard, she's believing badly, right? She has no reason at all to believe that she's going to be safe, to be rescued, right? She's got no reason at all, much less sufficient evidence, right? Clifford's standard is not just some reason, his standard is prove it, right? She certainly cannot do that. In fact, she has a good reason for thinking she will not be rescued. She's alone, outer space, looks very bad, right? But on the other hand, if this belief brings her some comfort in her final moments, is she really doing something bad? Right? Remember all the justifications that Clifford gave us for thinking, well, yeah, believing badly is a moral harm, had to do with one's potential impact on the world, right? Well, she's far removed from the world. It doesn't seem like there's anything that can happen as a result of her believing, aside from giving herself this small comfort, right? So it seems like Clifford's standard here is a bit detached. It's a bit detached from the reality of this particular circumstance, right? But once again, because Clifford made his claims universal, right? They apply all the time, everywhere, for everyone to believe anything, right? It should apply here too. But I think it doesn't, right? Maybe you disagree. I would be interested to hear what you think. But to me, it doesn't seem like there's any obvious moral harm that the astronaut would be doing in this case, right? All right, let's sum up for the week. If you think that Clifford's standard's too strong, you're going to need to have some other idea for another standard. Why? Well, we don't want to just allow any kind of believing in, right? Like the ship owner's wishful thinking, that's probably not going to cut it for you, right? Like, do you think the ship owner was right to believe in the way he did? Probably not. But why was it wrong, right? Why was it wrong for him to believe in that way? You're going to need a standard, right? If not Clifford's, something else, yeah? But then how much evidence is enough, right? Too little and you let in too much. But if you have too high of a standard, you start to agree with Clifford, and as James argues, you might end up sacrificing a number of useful truths, right? Note, however, you could agree with Clifford in his evidentialism, right? His thinking that in order to believe well, you can only believe in things you have sufficient evidence for believing, while not agreeing with the moral component of his view, right? We can, despite what Clifford does, we can tease these two apart. So you might object to one, not the other. Yeah. Okay, so next week, we're going to try to find some answers to questions like these, right? First, what is knowledge? Two, what is justification, right? What makes some beliefs more reasonable than others? And how much of it do we need for it to count as knowledge? That's more or less what these two have been sort of getting at, right? But yeah, we'll turn to that next week. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.